this video I'm turning my attention to creature sculptures. I'm going to have a go at sculpting up this orc general type character. If you're a regular on my channel, then you know that I've been focusing on robots and costume pieces in the last few videos, so I haven't done much creature sculpture, so I wanted to get back at that and have another go. And this has partly been inspired by the Dark Crystal, the Netflix series which has recently come out. And in London in the UK they actually held an exhibition in the British Film Institute which had a bunch of the puppets and sculptures and artwork that they created for the show. Now I should have really shot some video of this, but I wasn't at the time thinking of making a video, but as you can see from the images there's loads of really cool creature designs here, animatronics, puppets, models, just really inspiring if you're into this sort of thing. So I came away from the exhibition and from watching the show on Netflix, really wanting to have another go at doing some creatures. Now I've learned from painful experience that you can plough straight ahead and start adding in texture to your sculpture without first checking that proportions are correct. So what I'm doing here is to block out the sculpture and just make sure I've actually got the proportions and the shape of the piece right before I start putting in all of that detail. You can often end up in a situation where you've got tons and tons of really nice detail on the sculpture, but actually you've got the proportions wrong at the beginning, and that means you have to scrap the whole thing, go back, fix the proportions, and then redo all of your texturing details. So important to get the actual basic shape of it correct first. So I'm just sort of trying to be a little bit careful here before I get really stuck into doing all of the fun stuff. Now what I've been wanting to do for quite a while is to try and do a sculpture which had lots and lots of texture in it. I always think that texturing up sculptures is really the most fun part, and I certainly found that when I was doing my previous steampunk astronaut sculpture, the bit that I enjoyed the most of the sculpture was actually adding in all of the details in the skin. So I want to have another go at something like that, but I want to do a sort of a fantasy creature and take the skin texture sort of up a notch, so there's like tons and tons of really sort of craggy features, folds, scars, that sort of thing. So that made me think, well, maybe an orc or some sort of fantasy creature like that might be a good place to start, someone who's maybe been in some battles and has some fairly weathered and worn skin. Now I've actually come back to a few creatures that I started in previous videos here. You may remember my bat creature here, which is one of the first video series I ever actually did on my channel. Now the mould came out okay, but there were a few problems with it, so in a later video I actually looked at reforming the sculpture by pouring in some molten clay into the mould. Well, I've now cleaned up that sculpture and re-sculpted the back of it, so as you can see this one's pretty much ready for moulding again, so I'm going to have another go at that, I think. In a separate video I also looked at sculpting up this goat creature, and as you can see I've done a fair bit of work on it compared to how it looked in the video. Halfway through the video I found a picture of a Damascus goat, which is this really odd looking breed of goat, but I thought because it looked quite odd it would form quite a good basis for a sculpture. So I've reworked the piece that I did in that video to add more Damascus goat type features to it. So as you can see here he's actually looking a little bit more friendly, I think, perhaps in the previous version of the sculpture, but I do like the way that looks. So again I think I'm going to try and mould him as well. So I wanted to sort of basically start an entire series of creature sculptures that I could mould and then cast up as busts. I'm using ball bearings for the eyes here. I bought a variety of different sizes just so I had a variety to choose from, and I'm paying particular attention here to make sure that they're spaced correctly. On my previous bat sculpture I actually realised once I'd moulded it that the eyes were a little bit skew with, so it didn't look too bad, but after a while it did start bothering me. So as you can see here I've actually corrected the eyes in the new version because it did start to really annoy me after a while. So I'm trying not to repeat the same mistake here and just making sure that the eyes are correctly spaced. One thing I find when I'm working on faces is that if you can get the shape of the mouth correct early on, that really does help visualise the rest of the face. I'm not quite sure why that is, but I think if the mouth just looks a bit weird or distorted, then the whole face will as well. So I often find myself paying particular attention to the mouth early on. trying to cut in plenty of channels and things like that in the forehead. With skin over a face, what I find is quite useful is to sort of come up with the basic shape of the head, but then to lay the skin on top of that. The intention being that you want it to look like there are forms underneath the skin, sort of informing the structure of the head. So adding folds of skin on top of that does create an illusion of anatomy going on beneath the sculpture, and I find that that adds a degree of realism to it. I bought a bunch of ball-ended sculpting tools recently, so there's 3 here with different round ends, and I found these really useful for adding detail. Because they've got the rounded end, any detail you cut in is a little bit softer than what you might get with a hard-edged tool, so I found these things really useful. I wanted to focus on texture, particularly with this sculpture, so I picked an orc because I figured he might have particularly wrinkly and weathered skin. Maybe there's some scars from battle going on, things like that. This is the fun part, so I'm spending a lot of time cutting in a lot of skin detail, lots of folds, lots of wrinkles, lots of scars. I do find this soft-ended silicone sculpting tool particularly useful for smoothing out some of the detail that I've put in. One way to check that sculptures are looking okay is to look at them in a mirror. Alternatively, taking photos can be quite a good way to make sure that they're looking correct, because your eye can deceive you quite a lot. And once I'd taken a few pictures of this to put on Instagram, I did notice that the body of the sculpture looked a little bit too small. So what I've done here is to melt down some chavant clay, and I'm just pasting this on to bulk up the body a little bit more. Once I'd done that, I did find that it started looking a lot more correct, so that was really useful. And the other 2 sculptures I've got, I don't actually have any clothes, but I started thinking that this guy should probably have some armour. So what I've got is some of these clear egg shapes that I've used previously for some of my mech builds, and I'm thinking these are the ideal shape for some shoulder pads. So what I'm doing is cutting these down and adding some edging strips. Something that I've done previously is to use some sewing pins as rivets, so you literally just drill some holes, put the sewing pin in, glue it in place, and then snip off the stem. The end of those look quite nice, I think, so that's some good mechanical detail here. Now what I need to do is actually sculpt up a motif on the shoulder pad. My Cthulhu power arm that I made for the steampunk event recently had a motif of skulls and tentacles, so I thought I may as well carry on that idea. So I'm doing a similar design on the shoulder pad here that I had on my full-size armour for the event. So what I'm going to do is actually make a mould of this a bit later so I can have two identical copies, one for each shoulder. But in the meantime, I'm just using this for some sizing reference effectively while I sculpt up a breastplate. Now, I generally try and avoid sculpting hard edge stuff in clay simply because I find it quite difficult to get a nice smooth finish. But I think I'm going to have to do that here. So I figure I can get away with it given that it's just a portion of the breastplate. So I'm just trying to smooth out this clay as best I can. Now, sculpting hard edges into clay can be quite difficult, so what I've decided to do is use some of this soft aluminium wire just to give an edge around the neck. It's handy because I can bend that in place quite easily and then sculpt against it, and it's hard enough to stay in place when I do that, so that's going to be quite useful just for creating an edge here. Now what I also want is a motif on the breastplate as well, so I'm doing a similar design to the one that I've created for the shoulder pad. What these ball-ended tools are also useful for is actually creating pore detail in the sculpture. So I want to have skin texture throughout the sculpture, which is something I haven't really added to my other two creatures. I might in fact go back and do that, but I really want to do it for this sculpture. So what I'm effectively doing is just stabbing into the sculpture with the ball-ended tool. Because I've got a few different sizes, I'm sort of alternating between them to give a degree of randomness to it. But I'm finding that's giving quite a nice pore detail. What I'm then doing is coming in with my finger and also with this silicon-ended sculpting tool to smooth down the surface. Once you've got a lot of texture in there, it really does look quite nice. I think it does look like skin texture, so I'm quite pleased with that effect. So I decided to revise the design on the shoulder pad a little bit and add a little bit more detail. Now I've got that in a position I'm happy with, I'm now ready to make a mould. So what I'm doing is just gluing it onto some foam board and building a wall around the piece. And I can now pour in some silicone over the shoulder pad and leave that overnight to set. So I've left that overnight and I'm now putting apart the foam board, and there's my mould, looking pretty good. So the next step now is to mix up some resin and cast up 2 copies of the shoulder pad. And there we go, now I can put those onto the model, and we're getting pretty close to having this finished. I have previously worried about making a mould of something, casting it up, and then making a mould of that again. I did wonder whether a sort of a second generation copy like that of a sculpture would sort of lose some of the detail, but so far I've found that it's not actually that bad, so I'm not worrying too much about doing that here. So I think that's about it. There may be a little bit more refinement to do on the sculpture, but I think that's probably it for the time being. Now I've got 3 sculptures now ready to go, so I can see a mammoth moulding session on the horizon. So I may well video that, but for the time being I think that's it for this video. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Thanks very much for watching. I'll be posting videos on future projects, so if you'd like to keep up with what's going on, please do subscribe. Alternatively, you can visit my website, which is www.thedarkpower.com, or you can find me on Facebook, just search for The Dark Power.